morning, everyone. I want to thank you for joining today's important webinar on hostage kidnap response, how to avoid victimization and what to do if you can't. My name is Pete Morton. I'm the principal consultant at Morton Executive Decisions, and I'm joined by Kervin Aucoin of Aucoin Analytics today, and also the podcast This Week Explained. Today I'm speaking from the perspective of corporate leadership, specifically how organizations like yours are prepared to safeguard employees from these risks and how we respond when the worst happens. As a leader and advisor, I've had the opportunity to work with experts in security, law enforcement, and crisis management to develop comprehensive response protocols for incidents involving employees. Unfortunately, while we do everything we can to minimize the risk, these events still occur, and it's critical for businesses to have a strong, clear response strategy. That's exactly what we'll discuss today. How we protect our employees, how we respond when an incident occurs, and how we manage sensitive interactions with families, government agencies, and in the media. I'm going to let Kervin introduce himself real quick, if you don't mind, Kervin.
Yeah, and thanks a lot, Pete, for inviting me on here. I'm a Army veteran, 20 years of intelligence experience in the U.S. Army. I worked at ISR for U.S. Special Operations Forces. I played a critical role in planning and executing some of the hostage rescue missions done by Special Operations Forces, particularly across the African continent. I do have a deep understanding of the operational and the analytical aspects of what we call, in what I do now, which is an analyst for the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency. It's personnel recovery. But during my time supporting special operations, I was directly involved in these missions at rescuing hostages. Jessica Buchanan, Jeffrey Woodkey, these are just a couple of names of programs that I worked on. And I was used because I do have this ability to fuse intelligence and operational planning in order to ensure mission success. So now as I work with the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency, I am now working to develop strategies to safeguard both U.S. service members and civilians and contractors who are going around the world to some of the most dangerous areas. We're working on analyzing threats, identifying vulnerabilities. And so I'm going to come from, yes, a corporate side as well as I am the CEO of Aucoin Analytics, a private intelligence company, but I also work within the Department of Defense and do have been instrumental in writing doctrine and DoD instructions for personnel recovery from both the Department of Defense and the Department of State side. So thanks again, Pete, for having me on here.
Of course, and Kervin and I have known each other for quite a few years, and when I go somewhere, he's the guy I call and let know. So if something happens, and he has also just been instrumental in giving me some really good assessments of what's going on the ground, and when dealing with these types of situations. So let's first we want to focus on kidnap and hostage, but we also want to talk about exactly what we mean by hostage and kidnap in this context with dealing with corporate responsibility. Situations are often quite different and require distinct responses. There's many different types of situations that fall into kidnapping or hostage-taking categories. The majority of kidnappings, honestly, if we're looking at most of them, they're parental kidnappings, right? And often when you say to someone, you say someone was taken hostage, people envision like a standoff between law enforcement and a desperado at a bank or something. For this webinar, we're talking about kidnapping and hostage-taking with a ransom nexus. As it's often the most catastrophic for families, employees, and organizations as a whole. It is also, in my opinion, one of the most avoidable situations. So when you look back on a lot of these and do your lessons learned after actions, you find out that there's a pivotal moment where someone was vulnerable, and that vulnerability could have been mitigated. So, Kervin, if you don't mind, just kind of go into, you're more an expert on the hostage crisis situations. Would you mind going into what a hostage is? Maybe give us an example.
Yeah. So, and people might be thinking, well, hostage kidnapping, don't you kidnap somebody and make them a hostage? But especially from a U.S. government perspective, the words matter when you're trying to get support from Department of Defense or Department of State. And so a hostage specifically is an individual who's taken and held by a perpetrator who's intending to use that specific person to leverage the force of a third party. That's either the government, a company, a corporation, or a certain type of organization. And they're doing that to meet certain demands. Now, for businesses, that could mean holding employees so that they force the company to make concessions, like a ransom payment, or even a political action, or to make public statements, maybe against the United States or the country that they are working in. And I already brought up one hostage crisis that I was involved in my time in Africa, and it shows that, look, we're not just talking about employees of corporations. Anyone is at risk of being taken. I'm talking about Jeffrey Woodkey. He was a missionary with the Youth with a Mission Relief and Development. It's a nonprofit organization that was working out in Africa. And on October 14th of 2016, he was taken hostage from his home in Abalak, Niger. And like I said, it was something that I worked extensively on. And throughout my time in Chad and Niger, when I worked in Burkina Faso, we worked day in and day out trying to secure the release of Jeffrey Woodkey. And the important thing here is he wasn't naive about what was going on, and neither was his organization. They knew the risks of working in that region. But even with that awareness, he was still a victim of hostage taking. Now, he was released in 2023, thankfully. We worked very hard for that. But think about it. That's 6.5 years of his life gone. That's 6.5 years in fear, uncertainty, separation from his loved ones. And so it's a reminder that, first of all, the recovery operations, especially if you get the U.S. government involved, it's not quick. It's not easy. It all requires time and resources. Also, an incredible amount of coordination between the Department of Defense and the Department of State. And sometimes those two can be at odds with each other and cause even more chaos. And then even when they're successful, there is still that toll on the individual and their families. So you also have to take that into account in all of this. So while the move is usually calculated and strategic, they also want to do both things. They want to leverage political and financial incentives. So it's not just about, hey, if you send money and pay the ransom, that they're just going to be released. In these hostage situations, it is because a lot of times these people are U.S. citizens or work for the United States, and they have a political motivation to change things in the places that they work. These terror organizations need freedom of movement. That freedom of movement requires the United States and other governments to get out of that country to allow for that.
Sorry, I'm admitting somebody else real quick. Yeah, so in contrast, and thanks for that, Kervin. And I know there's some people on here who probably really would love to discuss that case with Kervin in the future. People have been very close to it and met Jeff before. So if you ever want to get in touch with him, please feel free to reach out or get his contact information from me. But in contrast, I want to talk about kidnapping. Kidnapping refers to the unlawful abduction of an individual for personal gain, such as ransom, human trafficking, or exploitation. Except we're talking about ransom in this or during this webinar. Situations more likely driven by personal motives or an immediate financial gain rather than a broader negotiation with external parties. One of the first cases that I ever really studied before I even started working on some of these myself was Amanda Lindau, who was a freelance journalist, traveled to Somalia to report on the country's conflict. She wasn't really trained. She didn't have any traditional schooling to be a journalist, but she liked to travel. And so this Nigel individual, Amanda was a Canadian, Nigel was Australian, and they would just travel around, had been to Afghanistan at different conflict zones, started reporting, and it was just a great way to have some adventure, but really no ties to any of the agencies they're reporting for. They were freelancers and no real training or anything, but they had gone to Somalia, one of the most dangerous places in the world for journalists. I think this was 2008. Political instability, armed groups. There was no centralized authority at the time, and Amanda and Nigel were both kidnapped just 3 days after arriving. So they were abducted by armed militants. This was all set up by people they had been working with, their fixer and whatnot. They were traveling outside of Mogadishu. Right when they got outside, initially their security, I believe it was their security escort, was the ones who kind of sold them out. And so they were held for, I believe it was 15 months, 460 days. They were tortured. Amanda had to convert to Islam in order to try and maintain her herself and not be assaulted over and over. They tried to escape once. They did almost escape, but they were caught again, and that turned into a huge deal. But um, the thing is, they weren't affiliated with anybody. She done some reporting for France 24 and some different agencies like that, but they didn't have like an overarching corporation over them. And so this really landed in the laps of their families. And so they're being held. I believe the ransom was up in the millions, 3 or 4 million or something like that. And dad's selling his house and his cars and trying to raise money through families, and it's just taking an extremely long time. But these kidnappers had the ability to go for a long time. It wasn't a huge investment on their part to feed and clothe them in Somalia and hire, one of the many people out of work to guard them for that long a period of time. It was an investment for them. They talk about that in her book. It's called A House in the Sky. I recommend, if you're interested in learning about all aspects of a kidnapping, that you read the book, or even better, listen to it on audio. She reads it. It's very compelling. But they were held for a very long period of time, and it was on their families to do with this. They tried to get the government involved. Well, the problem with this is it was a kidnap for ransom, but these criminal organizations were also connected to terrorist organizations, so it kind of muddied the waters a bit. And the governments were like, "Hey, you're in Somalia. What do you want us to do? We're not going to send in our special forces to go get you or anything like that." There was no coordination that was going to even happen through their government officials. They were released. They paid, I think it was 2.5 mil each, I believe it was. Maybe it was together, but I believe it was mostly Nigel's family. And then eventually, it didn't just end. Uh, they didn't have any recourse. There was no capture, or there was no arrest right away. And so she kind of lived it with a lot of trauma, wondering what's happening, and then found out they arrested one of the kidnappers, one of the main ones that was torturing her and assaulting her, in Canada. And he even had it in his mind that he was going to go meet up with her and they were going to have some kind of joyous reunion. It's just really weird how a lot of these, they don't just end when you recover the individuals. They go on long term. Fortunately for her, she was very good at dealing with the trauma. She actually started nonprofits and all sorts of stuff and continued to work in Somalia as a humanitarian and philanthropist. And I think that helps her heal a lot. But you can see a lot of the stories. I think Nigel did a TED talk and talked about how much he went through in those months and months of kidnapping when it came to trauma. And so kidnap and ransom, that's probably it's a very extreme version of it. But it is one of the ones, if you really want to learn about every aspect of it, it's a good idea to read that book. It's a great case to study and to learn from. But let's talk real quick. Now that we've defined what the difference between the two is, let's talk about the current state of the world in terms of the threat landscape, especially for corporations that operate internationally. The risk of both hostage and kidnapping situations is not only real, but it's growing due to geopolitical and economic instability, organized crime, and terrorism. But Kervin, if you don't mind giving us, put on your analyst hat and do a little predictive analytics for us on the situation, or the threat landscape around hostage situations that we're going into right now.
Yeah, and look, it's getting worse. The world is getting more dangerous. That's why Pete mentioned I started the podcast this week, explained it is a intelligence-based geopolitical podcast because the world was getting more dangerous. We saw that with the invasion in February of 2022. And we're seeing now with the collapse of the Middle East in places like Gaza, Lebanon, now Syria. And these situations and these events happen instantly. It's not, while they have been brewing for a while, they typically happen once people begin to forget about it. Let's take Syria, for instance. people had pretty much forgotten about Syria. There was a civil war that had been brewing for over a decade. That was because of the Arab Spring in 2011. I was actually at the Joint Special Operations Command doing operations in Syria as this was going on. So the threat landscape was pretty bad there. People had forgotten about it, and that's when these situations really kick off. Is once we've forgotten about it, and so now recently we saw a terrorist organization, HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, I believe. If I can go back to my old Arabic training. And so it's a former terrorist organization that defeated the Assad regime, threw Assad out, and is now trying to establish a government there. What's that? What does that mean for the people of Syria? Does it mean stability? Probably not. In 2011, there was a lot of media uprising or a lot of media fanfare about Hamas not being a violent organization anymore because of their agreements with the Palestinian Authority. And the media said that Hamas was going to take a nonviolent stance. Fast forward to October 7th of 2023 and the devastating events that happened in Israel. So you see how it all bottles up once we forget about it. Another aspect to that, and why I predict it's going to be even more dangerous, is today, as we're talking, this is January 9th of 2025. Lebanon just voted in a new president. It is a Western U.S.-backed presidential candidate. However, if you look at history, there's not a really good history of putting Western-backed, U.S.-backed leaders in the Middle East. Sometimes that causes a lot of chaos. So could that happen once again in Lebanon? When you're talking about intelligence analysis, you look at making assessments on probabilities. I have it as probable. My probable goes up to 99%. And I was telling somebody recently, when I was back at the command and I said probable, that is when weapons went downrange, because they knew that I was pretty sure something was going to happen. So getting back to where I visualize and where my assessment is on the threat landscape, it is probable that we will see an increase in hostage-taking activities in order to pressure the United States and the incoming President Donald Trump administration into being less severe in those countries, and in order to not have the U.S. military in countries like Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, and to remove them from those countries. In order to do that, they will continue to take hostages. Those hostages are not military personnel. They are called soft targets. Soft targets are anyone that are easily taken, and those soft targets come from various corporations. Usually, oil companies will see a lot of their employees be taken hostage, and then humanitarian personnel. So humanitarian personnel are a soft target, and I do see an increase in hostage taking from that area. And notice I'm saying hostage taking because I'm going to throw it over to Pete to talk about kidnappings and his assessment on the future of the specific term for kidnapping and kidnapping for ransom.
Yeah, thanks, Kervin, for kidnapping, and I totally agree with you. I know a lot of people are under the assumption that things are going to get better real quickly under the new administration. Some people maybe, but others not. But I do think it'll change. But I do think that with the amount of drastic changes that are being talked about, that there will be, of course, somebody will kick the hornet's nest a little bit, and there will be some adjustments on the threat landscape. But for kidnapping, unfortunately, it's a growing concern still. I wish it wasn't. I wish we were getting better at avoiding this and being proactive, but that's not what's happening. Criminal organizations are targeting individuals, executives, high net worth employees, and even mostly, and this is a new trend, but average employees who are just traveling in like volatile regions. In some cases, the incidents are organized by sophisticated, criminal networks, and then the threat extends beyond the individual to their families and even the company. But we're increasingly responding to smaller, decentralized organizations that take advantage of middle-class individuals for smaller ransom demand. We're seeing this a lot. First started seeing it really in Mexico, and many of you know I do a lot in Haiti, and going after, it's actually almost like taboo to go after a VIP down there now or somebody that's high profile. First off, it takes a lot of time, brings a lot of heat to the criminal organization, and it's not as good of an investment. If they go after normal people, just average, workers, they do a quicker turnaround for less, less ransom, but they do volume, more of them. They're actually making more money than they did trying to kidnap a VIP. And they're not bringing down the type of heat that typically comes with kidnapping a VIP. And so a lot of organizations they put a lot of focus protective security on, the CEOs, the executives, which they should. Of course, they're being targeted as well for other things as well. But they don't focus very much on the average employee traveling to a high-risk location. It's just not something that's been in their purview. But I know that certain organizations are starting to, because it's the best way to measure it. The statistics out there are not very good. Like if you look at the UN statistics, the last 2 years is when they start collecting US stats, and it's like 56,000 or something like that per 100,000. It's just because of the way it's defined, and I think they're including a lot of the parental kidnappings and other ones in there. And then other countries, it's maybe 100 per 100,000, and like some of the places we know where there's a lot of kidnappings, a lot of these go unreported. I know that for a fact, or underreported, especially because the reporting goes through local governments. It doesn't go to the United States, the UN, it goes to the local government. They're going to report it. And if the local government happens to be involved, nobody's going to report that kidnapping. So it's hard to determine how many. The way I determine it is by the volume. And I tell you, this year, the last year and a half, we've rescued 235 people, which is actually, I mean, it's crazy. It's a lot, and I know that's because we've been getting word of mouth, and we get more and more requests because of that. But that's a lot of people. That's not all. That's not 230 incidents, by the way. That's 230 people spread out over 5 incidents. Now you might say, "Oh, that's not very much." That's a lot. Okay, it's not the movies. That's a lot for me. It's just I'm just a consultancy. But just in the last 3 months, I've gotten three of those. So three of those were separate incidents. And so there is an increase in kidnap for ransom going on. That's not all out of Haiti, by the way. A couple of those are in Haiti, but Latin America seems to be the focus for kidnap for ransom still. Um, and so anybody operating in those areas that's not focusing, of course, on their average employees should probably start to. And you will start having to focus more on it, because these incidents are probably going to keep happening as economic stability still, it's just not going to happen overnight. No matter if Donald Trump comes in and saves the day in the United States, it's going to take a long time for developing nations and destabilized nations to catch up. Every time we have a shift where our inflation goes up, you can quadruple that in a developing nation. And so you're going to see more and more people get desperate, joining different gangs to do these types of kidnap for ransoms. And then they're not all organized. It's never like the movies. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute here, but sometimes it's just a group of guys that are, maybe dabbling in some kind of criminality, and there's a target of opportunity that pops up, and they decide to take them because they're all high. And so, it's just, and then it becomes very, fluid and chaotic, and you have to be able to adjust and deal with that. But there is an increase in kidnap for ransoms going on right now, and it's something that we should all be probably planning for right now to deal with in the future.
I could add just one more thing, Pete,
course.
that I didn't get to, and I talked about the Middle East a lot, and Pete's talking about Latin America with hostage and kidnapping. You fuse both of those together, and I would like to put another assessment out there for the African continent, because of the way that both the French and the United States have been removed from the African continent, especially the Western Sahel. So that's places I worked in Niger, Nigeria, Burkina Faso. They've removed Western forces in place of Russian mercenaries and Chinese businesses. And so the threat landscape is increasing for Western, especially Western-backed corporations and humanitarian organizations that are working on that continent. I've worked, like I said, a lot there, and I do a lot of analysis on that continent. And so if you're working or you have people working on that continent, there needs to be a lot of proactive measures in place before they go out there.
And that's a great segue into the next section of mitigation and avoidance. Now, like I said, it's never like the movies, all right? And then the way you mitigate kidnapping is probably gonna be very specific to your organization and how you operate, what your specific mission is, the region you're in. But these are just a few of the things that we've identified as being great ways to mitigate, where you can almost mitigate 100% of the time kidnapping or hostage taking. The first one being informing travelers. Now, I know over the past 20 years that I've been in travel risk management, uh, it used to be taboo to try and tell your travelers of what they were walking into. And most of the pushback I would get from execs is, we don't want to scare our employees because they're not going to travel if we tell them everything that's going on. And what's happened is over the years, we we have unfettered access now to information, and now it's going into, of course, misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda, and all sorts of other things. And AI is involved, and you can't tell what's real and what's not. And so it's not a matter of scaring your employee. You don't have to do that. They're already scared. They're getting way too much information now, and you need to provide them with um, facts that they can use to be more aware first off, and then make decisions. And then you might get some pushback and say, "Hey, I'm not going to this place if this is what it's like." But if you can provide them with the information they need, and then also this is how we're mitigating the threat, and also these are the resources that we can bring to bear if something does happen, you actually provide that traveler with a sense of confidence, and confidence in you as an organization, that you actually have their back and you're going to watch out for them and take care of them, that you're thinking about these things. And so more and more companies are coming around to, hey, we need to do pre-travel reports. We need to maybe do some training. And we need to identify employees that are not ready to go to these high risk locations, and maybe postpone it or switch them out with somebody who is. And so, it says there, knowledge is power, and employees need to know where they're going. The more aware they are, the easier it's going to be for them to avoid places they shouldn't be traveling into, neighborhoods that they should be going into, to understand the culture that they're walking into, and not inadvertently, offending somebody in a culture, automatically making them a target, or just adding to the motivation of criminals to take them. And so just information is key. That's the first and foremost thing that we find can help mitigate some of these situations. Kervin, want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you why I agree with Pete on all of these. And I always do that in telling anecdotal stories of real world lessons that I learned. I was being interviewed for a position to set up a site, an ISR site on the African continent. The company wanted to set up a site in Somalia, but they couldn't find anybody. No one wanted to go. They asked me, would you be willing to go to Somalia, which at that time was extremely dangerous, and it still is extremely dangerous to this day. I said I would go, and they asked me, why would you go? And there were two reasons. One, I was educated on the area as an intel analyst that worked counterterrorism, and two, I knew I was a valuable asset to not only the company, not only to the United States, but also the company, so they would have resources in case something would happen. And so that anecdote shows that if you are educated, you're not scaring people if you're educating them. Just what Pete said, if you're showing how you're going to mitigate risks, what you're going to do, how you're going to support the families if something does happen, that's going to be key to kind of quell those fears from whatever employee might be scared to go into those areas. And I'd also say, don't lie to the employees. Don't tell them that it's going to be safe. I worked overt anti-Russian aggression in Poland. Poland's not, known as some scary, dangerous place like it would be in the Middle East. It's not an austere location, but we were warned ahead of time that there are go and no-go zones in the country of Poland because of that Russian aggression, and that we were not allowed to be in those zones. So to be educated on what zones to go into and what zones not to go into really helped us as a team to set up the site out there. And there were, besides maybe some other incidents that alcohol was a part of. There were no incidents where anyone was kidnapped or anything like that while we were in that country. We felt safer because we knew the company had our back and we knew the risks when we were getting in there.
Yes, if anybody offers you free alcohol, say no. Just saying.
Just say no.
We may have had to deal with that, Kervin and I together once or twice. Not us personally, but people we know.
Right.
Identify surveillance, and this is important. A lot of people grow up in a very secure environment in the West. They're not used to walking around with their head, quote unquote, on a swivel. They're not used to looking for people, who pop up, at random places more than once, knowing that, okay, this is not a coincidence. But if you can make them aware, it's like, hey, if you see this person hanging around, you see them more than once, 3 times or whatever, then you may have to switch up your patterns that you're setting. May have to keep an eye out for that person. Making sure that they, somebody's hanging around their room, or getting into their elevator with them, not pushing the button. Little things, just simple things that make them more aware. And to tell you the truth, every time I've had to do that kind of training with people, they think it's cool. They think it's awesome. They think they're, learning some James Bond stuff or Jason Bourne stuff, and that's fine. You want them to feel confident enough to travel, but understand, just to be aware they can avoid. And in a lot of the situations I've dealt with where people have been taken, like I said, it always comes down to that. Somebody's doing recon typically, unless they're a real soft target, right? A target of opportunity, which does happen too. Somebody's doing recon. They're either looking at their social media feeds, which we'll talk about in a minute as well, or they're hanging around and watching their patterns and picking them up at some place they know they're going to be, or they have somebody on the inside who's feeding them information about that person, which also happens quite often. But if they can know how to look for that surveillance and that targeting, just a little bit of training goes a long way. Kervin?
Yeah. Another. I guess I just won't use it as an anecdote, but what I will say is use the surveillance against the person. So let your employees know what we say in the United States is if you see something, say something. But what we do a lot is if you're seeing something that looks suspicious or a person that may be surveilling and it's very suspicious, and you can engage maybe with that person, ask some questions. And what we've done in the past is take a picture with that person, start a friendly conversation, take a picture, send that picture. They could send that picture back to their boss or to whoever in the company that they're working for. And those people can then start trying to identify, were they being surveilled, or is this just a friendly person that's interested? Because let's say you're on the African continent, and I say this all the time, it's not even just about race. I was a white guy in the Western Sahel. I stood out. I saw a white female once with a rose-colored dress on. I knew she was from France because she stood out. When you stand out like that, you become an easy target. And people are also going to be interested in what you're doing there. So if you get some information out of them and then just let them go on their way, but keep that in the back of your mind that could be a surveillance attempt, that does a lot more than trying to be very aggressive with a person.
Of course, on the corporate side of that, I'm going to say that's you got to be careful, of course, with that engaging. But if somebody's already engaging, then then why not take a picture with them? If they're coming to sit at the bar with you and chatting you up and asking you all sorts of probing questions or whatever, you want to know, who is this person, what they're doing. If I could pass that on to my, security team, then do it. Social media is probably the number one thing nowadays that we're pushing to everybody and understanding. I know we're all used to, hey, I had this cool moment. I'm putting it on Instagram right now and popping it out to everybody. And I've had to do a lot of online footprint analysis where I look at, a principle and say, okay, look, you're posting every time you eat food, the restaurant's name, and then you're going there 3 or 4 times a week at the same times. You're setting patterns. You're posting pictures of your family and, in front of the Eiffel Tower and then in front of your hotel. There's too much sharing going on. And if your organization does not have a social media policy, you should. What I do, I like to take pictures too and share it with people. I mean, I want them to know I travel. It's part of my brand. They need to know I travel. I'm well traveled. but I'll take pictures. I'll wait till I get home and I'm done with the trip, and then I'll post them. It's simple things like that. And then I'm not posting them, with a geotag and whatnot. And I get a little bit, I guess, paranoid about that. But I use Twitter all the time right now. If we're looking at insider threat or somebody's making a threat against somebody, Data Miner does this, and another company called Scope Now. You can also do it through, if you're on X, you purchase the a subscription to X, you have X access to TweetDeck. And with TweetDeck, I can set up a Boolean logic search and base it off location. And if somebody hasn't turned off their geotag, whenever they're tweeting something, it's tweeting their location. The way I use that is like, hey, if we know somebody is making threats toward a principal, and I have that set up, and all of a sudden, this person's tweeting and they're only like 3 meters from the principal, then we're going to be, concerned about that. But it's a way of tracking them. And there's all sorts of ways to do that through different social media platforms nowadays. And that's a lot of the way, these express kidnappings that are happening, that's how they're happening. They're just looking at the feed. They've never met the person face to face, aren't in the same country, but they're able to convince somebody, that they have that person because of how much information that individual is posting on the internet. So when it comes to your organization and traveling and your employees, have a social media policy that they need to follow. They should follow, and then inform them. Don't say, hey, you can't post, and leave it at that. They're still going to post. Make sure you're explaining, hey, if you post this way, this is, you're setting a pattern. You're leaving a breadcrumb trail for somebody to follow, and maybe potentially turn yourself into a victim. And I'll talk about social media a little bit more when we talk about response as well, because there's some other things that come out from that. Kervin, I know this is a big one for you too. You like to?
Yeah. Social media is huge. It changed the game. It really did. It did so much that it has its own intelligence category, SOCMINT, social media intelligence, that falls under open source intelligence, or OSINT. Social media is what Pete said, a treasure trove. It's a gold mine for anyone who's looking to do bad things. And that's because it is not just because you have near real time updates on where people are. You also have you have a way to track people from their past actions. So you can see a post on Instagram where it's like Tuesdays at Maury's Pizza. They know on Tuesdays you're going to be at this specific location at a certain time. That is very dangerous for the person involved, and it is a treasure trove for any bad actors. It also, your social media has what we like to call a link analysis, or a network. It shows your entire network. I just worked on a television series where I showed how corporate intelligence was being used to, or could be used to, track individuals, and each of the people involved in the show, their information was tracked through social media, and we were able to track everything that they did from the moment they got the call to be on the show to the moment that they got to the location, all through social media. And we tracked their entire network and knew things about them that even they had forgotten that was online. So social media is very important. If you don't have a program to identify what to do and what not to do on social media, you're behind the game. But that doesn't mean you can't start now, and should start talking to your employees about social media. It's not about freedom of speech when you're an employee of a company. This is about being safe and being protected.
Yeah, and that goes into, we were talking about patterns. Social media is a great way to identify patterns on different people and where they're going and everything else. And so we want people to avoid doing that. That's another thing. When you're doing, you got to think from the bad guy's perspective. They're going to go after somebody. They're going to kidnap them. They're going to do some recon. And that could be eyes on surveillance, or, like I said, going on social media, talking to people that they know, talking to the front desk at the hotel, and trying to find out when they come in and leave, those kind of things. So avoid setting patterns. The biggest part of this, it's not hard to avoid setting a pattern. Leave different times, don't eat the same place all the time, those kind of things. But what happens is with corporations is, hey, you need to be at work at this time every day, 5 days a week. Give them some leeway. Hey, we want you to come in at this time, today, or hey, just take a break. Come in 2 hours late today. If you have meetings with people and you're not sure, you haven't vetted them properly, what I always do is, especially most cultures, being fashionably late is not a huge deal, except for in the United States, typically, or maybe Germany. Thomas. But it's okay, Hey, let's meet at this time, and then push it out a little bit, or show up a little bit earlier. Um, you don't have to set, it's good to avoid setting those patterns. And it's got to be a conscious effort. And the more conscious that person is about not setting patterns, the more self-aware they are as well, and aware of their surroundings. So it's kind of like a double thing, a double-sided thing that gives you a little bit more awareness. You're being conscious about not setting the patterns, so you're looking around a little bit more for people who may be targeting you, and you're mixing it up to where they can't figure out where you're going to be and pick you up. Kervin?
Yeah. I got the pause there. Sorry about that. So avoiding patterns is a big thing, that we are creatures of habits as humans. And so bad actors are going to use that against us. Another thing that avoiding a pattern does is you can start to identify similar people that are tracking you if you move your patterns around. So if you take 3 different routes into work at 3 different times, but you see the same individual on different days doing something or watching you, then you know that they have identified where you're coming from and where you're going. And so they're tracking through that way, and that sets up a pattern for that person as well. And that information can be very good whenever you're trying to stay safe in these areas. So not using the same route, and staggering. What we would do a lot is stagger our people as they're coming in. So you have a site lead that goes in at a certain time, and then other employees will come in at different other times. And then we would flip days to nights, or flip middays to mornings. And yes, that can be terrible for some sleep schedules, but it's far worse in an austere location to be kidnapped or taken hostage than it is to kind of shift around your sleep schedule.
Yeah, and that, including one of the biggest problems we've seen lately. There's so many ways to keep track of, different itinerary schedules, calendars, all that kind of stuff, and they're not that easy to get into, to tell you the truth. And then a lot of times, people are just mass blasting out their plans to everybody. Sometimes they're posting it, and it's really, I mean, recently, was it the executive that got assassinated, unfortunately? I think that guy was able to find him because people were telegraphing his location, telling people where he's going to be and whatnot. And of course, he didn't have the proper mitigation with him. But making sure that you lock down your information and itineraries and plans and personal information, PII, all that needs to be extremely well controlled. That is where people are failing really, really terribly right now, is locking down their information. If I wanted to find out where somebody's going to be, a lot of times I'll be able to get a client by doing that. It's like, oh, I don't need security. It's like, okay, here's your schedule. Thank you. It's not that hard to find that. So you got to make sure you're locking down that information. I'm going to go on to the next curve, and just for time here. I want to focus on the response, really. Um, you know, despite our best efforts, there's always a possibility that employee can become a victim of a hostage situation or kidnapping. If you're doing as much as you can to mitigate, I am telling you, any clients that I've had where we've had to do recovery were outside clients that did not work with me previously. The clients that I've worked with previously, and we've had situations that have turned into potential hostage or attempted hostage or kidnappings. But if they worked with me, we had plans in place to mitigate. One recently was a whole orphanage I've been working with for a couple of years, where we did physical security assessments, we identified evacuation routes, we did dry runs, we went through, with the kids involved, and they didn't mind it too much. But we did all these different things, and then when the threat of a hostage situation was there, we flipped the switch. And we didn't hesitate. We didn't say, well, let's wait and see. Or, that's the worst thing, is when you have a plan in place and then everybody starts second guessing it because they're scared to think of the situation. That didn't happen in this case. We flipped the switch. Kids were actually on the run for 3 days around the country, avoiding this group that was trying to take them hostage. But we did get them to safety We were having to figure out, LZs and all sorts of other things on the fly, but we had a good idea of what was going to happen. Now, when it comes to planning, to deal with these situations when you can't avoid them, uh, there's a certain type of person that you need to have in place. Now, coming from the corporate side, working with nonprofits, companies, and things like that. Um, no offense to Kervin or anybody else in the government, because I used to work for the government too. They're not necessarily the best person to put in charge. They're used to doing things a certain way where the motivation is 100% different than it would be if you're on the corporate side or if you're a family member or something like that. Often there's a justice mindset compared to, just resolution. And so they're thinking, yeah, we want to get these kids to safety, but let's also take down the bad guys too. And so you have to make sure you put the proper person, or if that person is coming from that background, fine, but make sure that they understand that what the motivation is, for your organization. And so when you're planning that, you have to bring that into play. And so when you're planning these things out, you typically need to find somebody that is not an SOP follower, if that makes sense. You want to have some guidelines. You want to have some best practices, but you need somebody that's super agile and that can make decisions, the right decisions on the fly, and deal with 100% totally new tactics, techniques, and procedures that you've never seen before. So you need to find somebody that is really good at that when you're putting this plan into place. And you don't want to plan it where it's a checklist. If you use a checklist, you're going to get halfway down the checklist and it's going to get tossed out the window and you're not going to have any plan. So you need to plan it with enough wiggle room to really make some decisions on the fly. So we did that with this one. We were successful. The kids are safe. The ones, like I said, that I've had to deal with, because once you get to this point where somebody's been taken, you absolutely have no control. You are reactive. There's no more proactivity. You are not in charge of anything. You are reacting to whatever these bad guys want you to do. Like I said, it's not like the movies where a negotiator comes in and takes over and you got this whole group and the company's calling the shots. It's never like that. It's always family members get called. Kidnappers want to call the family members because they're more emotionally involved and they'll pay more money and they'll pay it faster. They're not going to talk to a negotiator. If it's a government run, or they're calling the FBI and it's like a hostage situation, like what Kervin deals with a lot, that's totally different. And like he said, that's why it takes a lot longer. For me on my side, typically what I'm doing is just holding people's hands, trying to keep them calm, trying to coach them a little bit before they get on the phone. But essentially, it's up to the family to really to manage. So you need to integrate that into your plan. Understand that as a corporation, you have no say so in it whatsoever. You're not even supposed to be involved in it. And sometimes it's better not to be involved with it. It's like let the family deal with it. I have one recently where it was like, well, we want to help them out. Should we, give them some money to pay the ransom? This, like, if they can do it on their own, let them do it on their own. And then maybe after the fact, you come in and do a donation or something to help them financially get back on their feet. Then you're not paying a ransom. You're helping that person individually. And then your organization's not connected to it because if you're still going to be operating in that location long term, then that could cause a lot of problems for you in the future. They're going to know, okay, this company paid out a ransom. Let's start targeting everybody. And it does happen, trust me. So you want to make sure that you integrate that into your plan and really understand how these things work, and find the right person to do that plan and be able to make those decisions on the fly and help you with that. You're going to make decisions you never had to make before. So make sure that you have a good plan in place. Kervin, you want to add to that real quick?
Yeah, I'm not going to push back on your talk about involving the government and having a good plan in place because we call it the sheer weight of the U.S. government. Getting involved comes red tape and bureaucracy. But if you have that plan in place and your employee understands the plan, and I'll go back to what Pete said about checklist, having a lengthy checklist doesn't do much unless you have trained and you know what you're going to do in these. So if you are going to make a checklist, make sure it's very small and that they understand what to do and include the flexibility of that. And you as a corporate, if you're a corporation and you have employees over, someone in your company has a personal relationship, I would hope, with the person involved. And that is a lot more weight to it than getting involved with the government or things like that, which is just sees a person as a number. So if you involve that person into it and that personal experience, and then when you're doing this training, I always like to make it fun. No, it's not something that we're just going to sit around and do a bunch of PowerPoint presentations. We're going to get out and do hands-on kind of things, and we're going to have fun with it. And those fun things, if you can make it a fun experience that is then a core memory, that's what you're trying to install, is a core memory into these individuals. If something does happen, that core memory is going to come back to the forefront of their mind, and they're going to be a lot safer because of that.
Yeah, and I'm going to start blowing through a couple of these because we're out of time. We wanted to leave room for questions, and we'll stay on for a few minutes after 12 if anybody wants to ask them. But when it comes to contacting authorities, you have to be really careful about this. In certain countries, what happens is, I do a lot of work side by side with the FBI. We've helped each other out quite a bit when it comes to especially international American involved kidnappings. So you kind of have to let them know. But they're very good at actually understanding where they're operating too. And it's like, hey, if you can handle this, Pete, on your own, please do. We'll feed you information. But if you tell us about what's happening, then we're going to be using local assets on the ground, and those local assets might actually be involved in the kidnapping. Or they're going to decide, hey, we're just going to go take down the bad guys. You guys have no more authority here. They're kicking down doors, and that's like the last thing you want to happen, right? So you got to make sure, but the areas that they're operating in. The proper way to contact the authorities if you need to, and when not to. Honestly, I'm not going to tell you not to do it. It's got to be up to your organization. But there are times where you're going to be like, man, should I really get these people involved? And often those authorities, especially on the U.S. side, don't want you to call them and tell them about it, because then they have to get involved, and then it turns into, like he was saying, this long protracted, event. So if you can resolve it faster, privately with the family, that's typically, the direction we go, depending on where they're at. And then the other part of this is, on top of that, if you have a local trusted network, it's really important to build that trust and know those people on the ground that you can use. If something like that, let's take Haiti, for instance. If that happens, somebody gets kidnapped, an American down there, I'm not going down there to resolve this. I'm not like driving around the car, picking them up and stuff like that. It doesn't work that way. I stand out like a sore thumb down there, and they're going to know. So it's good to have a local trusted network of people that you can work with to understand the culture. They understand how to deal with these kinds of things. So that's something you have to build beforehand. That's that's part of your planning process. Like, who do I know down there that I can trust to do the right thing when I ask them to. And then this is the biggest one. I want to focus on this a bit. I know we're running out of time here, but like I said, when you're dealing with these situations on the kidnap side and the hostage side, you're not making the decisions. It is going to come down to family members making decisions. So you gotta come alongside a family member who's probably distraught and emotional. They might be, beating the person or torturing them, showing them, when you're doing a proof of life or something, showing that person all beat up and trying to get that person to work with you to where they don't say too much. A big problem I have is, if we're not involved in the situation from the beginning, they call the family member and automatically mom's like, yeah, we got 200K in the bank. Well, you just set the baseline. Good job. Now they're going to up that continuously. Okay, you have 200, but we know by your social media feed that you have a Range Rover and a G-Wagon in your driveway. Go sell those. Oh, yeah, and by the way, go sell your house. But when you get done with that, then we'll talk about release. So you have to be careful. That's why it's always good if people are going to high risk locations already. You need to make sure that individual understands what they're getting into, and that they're family members, and that they know somebody, and that person in their phone of, this is the person in my family I want you to call. I don't want you to call my mom. She's going to freak out and have a heart attack. So there's a lot of planning that needs to go into place, and a lot of conversations, uncomfortable ones that have to happen. That's why you need to find that person. That's not like the SOP by the book. You're going to do what I say type of person. It has to be a person that can influence, that can come alongside, have empathy, real empathy too, not just fake. Real empathy for the family members, understanding what they're going through, so you can convince them to do things your way, and so that they don't create a long, drawn out, situation that could have been resolved within a week and a half. So, Kervin, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I think I really just want to say this really quick, that if something like this does happen, whether it's hostage or kidnap for ransom, and this person is returned back to their family, it doesn't end there, right? We talk about the trauma response and having certain avenues to talk about this. There could be more damage after the fact because of the trauma that was experienced. If the family members don't understand it and the person who's coming back doesn't have an avenue to talk about the situation that they were in. So all I will say is it's a continuous cycle. And when you do return that person, it's awesome and it's great for the family and everyone. But your support doesn't stop there. You need to continue to support that person in whatever way they need it.
Yeah, that was part of the trauma section down there in D too as well. I'm going to combine those two. Another part of it is the confidentiality part. When it comes to these kidnappings, first off, like I said, social media is a treasure trove of information. And I've known people who are doing negotiations and stuff who would tell the family member who's on the phone with this kidnapper, hey, you need to, they're telling them to lie, essentially. And that is very dangerous. First off, if this turns into a 15-month long, standoff here, trying to keep up with whatever lies you told is impossible. And then that could lead to, beatings or even death for the kidnapped victim if these kidnappers find out. If you're lying about how much your net worth is, if you're lying about what you have access to, your job, who you have proximity to, they can find that information out. Often they have eyes on the family and are doing surveillance on the family. So if you have family saying, "Oh, we don't have the money, we can't get it," and like I said, that example of, well, you have this car in your driveway, sell it, or I wasn't able to sell it, and it's not there anymore. Or you have to make sure that they're being honest, but not just giving out a ton of information. So you have to, they need to be honest with the kidnappers to a certain extent, and then figure out ways to, and that's why it's good to have somebody coaching them and talking with them and saying, hey, you need to say it this way. When you get on the phone next time, let's role play a little bit on how you're going to talk to these people. And then not sharing any of that information outside of the group. The craziest thing was when we resolved one kidnapping and we were in transit back. We had picked them up, and I'm looking at that person's Facebook profile, and they're already posting, "Oh, I was just released on Facebook," to everybody. And I was like, they came up, I grabbed their phone and said, "You'll get this back when we're completely done." And they were like texting about, who was driving them and all sorts of stuff. So it's just, you have to be really careful about um, how much, how you're controlling information and maintaining confidentiality. And it does continue on after the fact. A lot of these kidnappings just turn into extortion. If you tell anybody about this, we'll kill you and your family. If you tell anybody about this, we're going to go after your kids. And we know where you live now. And we have all your information and all this other stuff. So it continues on and on and on. And they never tell anybody about it. And so maintaining confidentiality, making sure that information stays. And then not sharing it after the fact is the hardest part, I think, for people in our industry. You want to talk about it, brag about what you did. It's all cool, but you can't do that. You just can't do it. I can't talk about any of the situations that I've helped resolve. I can talk about them generally as case studies, but I'll never tell you who, where, when. And so it's important to maintain confidentiality. And I know we're out of time here, but tactical response is the thing you want to avoid at all costs. Okay, so when you're looking, if you ever have to retain somebody to help you with a situation like this, make sure that they're not door kickers looking to go down and get the rocks off. And there are a lot of those people out there now. You need somebody who's a fixer, somebody who's a project manager, somebody who can think on their feet, is agile, and will empathize with that person who's being held captive so they can get them back as safely and quickly as possible without any kind of tactical response. I know we put up a picture on our advertisement. It was kind of a joke of us all geared out, me and Kervin. We're both a couple of Intel nerds. Okay. Yes, we've had to do that kind of stuff before, but we're not going down in these countries with our guns and kicking down doors. That's not happening. And so you want to make sure to avoid that tactical response as much as possible. That's why the government ones take so long. That's why sometimes ours take long too. And then understand that you will pay the ransom typically. I know a lot of people have a policy. We're not going to pay any ransom. It's like, okay, it's not up to you. It's up to the family. So how are you going to support the family in that aspect? Maybe that's good to have that. And one more thing, kidnap ransom insurance. It's good to have it. I recommend you don't tell anybody you have it. The minute you tell people that you have it on one person, they're going to know you have it on everybody else. and then you're just making everybody a big target. And you don't even need to tell the person that's going that you have kidnap or ransom insurance. It's good to have after the fact, and that's what it's going to be after the fact. If you're using an insurance company that's making a recommendation of somebody to use to resolve it, understand that person's an insurance adjuster. They're working for the insurance company, so they might not give you the best deal, and they're going to be looking to pay out as little as possible, because they work for that insurance company. So it might be good to engage somebody, a third party outside. If you're getting a policy that says you have to use their person, run away, try and find somebody that'll reimburse. Okay. That is, I'm sorry we ran out of time. We could talk about this for a very long time, but I want to leave some time for question. We'll stay on as long as you guys want. Just, does anybody have questions? You can feel free to throw them in the chat or just hop on and ask. It's fine. All right. Well, Kervin, do you have any final thoughts you want to throw in?
Just what I said from the beginning: be proactive. When you start getting reactive, that's when things kind of go haywire. And I would like to. I see Max Mintz is in here. I'd like to shout out a good friend of mine, Max, who works out in Colorado. That's all I'll say. Thank you.
All right, y'all. Thanks again for joining. Appreciate it.